Well, hello and welcome back to Sibylline Insights. Today coming to you online. Unfortunately, some disruption in the UK has stifled our efforts to get into Sibylline Studios. However, we do have a really interesting conversation for you today on all things Turkey. Now, the Turkish elections of 2023 were cited by many commentators to be historic. Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the incumbent president, was said to be as close as he has been in his nearly 20-year reign to being ousted by the opposition. However, after a first round where neither opposition nor incumbent was able to get the required 50%, upon seeing the results, it became clear that the incumbent Erdogan had indeed won a fifth term. Today we're here to discuss the implications of this for the region, the globe, and indeed Turks themselves with Associate Analyst Megan Sutcliffe. Megan, it's great for you to join us and welcome to the pod.
Thank you for having me.
So I said in the introduction that this was a historic year for the elections. It was the closest that Erdogan had come to being ousted by Kemal, the main opposition candidate. Why this year? Why was it so close, and why is it cited as being such a close-run thing?
So there were many issues that have arisen over Erdogan's last term as president that have made this election particularly tight. In the medium term, we've had the multiple earthquakes in southern and eastern Turkey that really showed many of the issues that have arisen given corruption and clientelism under the Erdogan government, given failing building regulations and the impact that had on civilian populations in affected areas. In the shorter term, exogenous shocks, including the war in Ukraine, have severely impacted the Turkish economy, and Erdogan's unorthodox economic policy of cutting interest rates to address double-digit inflation have meant that many Turks are now facing a cost of living crisis that severely undermines their incomes and decreases their purchasing power. These factors have combined to make the opposition to Erdogan able to ally themselves into a strong national alliance that truly gave him a run for his money, even though, unfortunately, they were not successful in their efforts to unseat him.
So it seems all the stars aligned here to end a reign of 19, 20 years. However, as you said, it didn't happen. So who was voting for Erdogan? I mean, I was just in Turkey recently, and everyone I spoke to was very enthusiastic about Kemal, giving him the thumbs up. Is it a demographic difference? Is it by age? Is it by geography? How did Erdogan get across the line? Who voted for him specifically?
There were many factors that played into Erdogan winning 52% of the vote in the second round of the presidential elections. He mainly capitalized on his traditional party homelands of more rural, more elderly and more conservative voters, tending to suffer from lacking support in urban and more progressive demographics. There are many factors, though, that will have contributed to Erdogan winning and entering his third decade in power. Those include the long-term factors and legacy of his economic policies through the early 2000s that lifted millions out of poverty and radically changed Turkey's infrastructure, but also there is credence to be given to Erdogan's strong campaigning profile and his abilities. He effectively characterized Kılıçdaroğlu as someone who would be weak on crime and weak on terror. And unfortunately, the opposition's inclusion of a Kurdish party in their alliance allowed Erdogan to characterize them as being beholden to the Kurdish Workers' Party, the PKK.
So you raised a lot of things there, from economics to the demographics, potential security concerns, the Kurdish question, and his framing of the opposition. I'd just like to maybe go into that first point you raised, actually, about his campaigning profile. Whilst there's no doubt that he has a base and he was able to, I guess, dominate the information space, there is a piece that I've seen written that Erdogan really controls a lot of the state media, for example, and the means of information. So to that end, there have been some commentators that have said, whilst the elections were free, they weren't fair. Is that itself a fair characterization of the lead up to the elections?
Absolutely. Multiple international observers have noted that while practices such as ballot box stuffing were lacking and that elections were fair, they were not free in the sense that Erdogan massively mobilized state resources to support his campaigns. He also used his position as an increasingly authoritarian leader to make promises that were not available to the opposition alliance. But when it comes to the media space in Turkey is predominantly dominated by the state, and the uneven and often biased coverage of opposition parties certainly undermined their efforts to communicate with voters through traditional means, including television and radio.
Okay, so again, a lot of factors. And before we get on to maybe the medium, long-term implications, economy, security, international relations, I just want to touch on, you said it was mainly the urban centres that were voting against Erdogan and the maybe more rural areas. To that end, are we seeing any civil unrest, security concerns, protests in these population centres in the aftermath of this result?
So largely, we have not seen civil disobedience or domestic unrest in the aftermath of the election. The opposition have accepted the results and have not called for mobilization. However, it is possible that we will continue to see mobilization, particularly in Turkey's southern and eastern districts, with significant Kurdish populations, giving ongoing tensions between the Erdogan administration and certain Kurdish parties.
And then maybe stepping back from that, you said one of the reasons, of course, was the economic position. So whilst, am I right in saying, whilst his economic policies are largely damaging, they were actually made from a populist position in order to curry favour. So do you see, now he's won the election for another however many years, and we'll get onto that. Do you see these economic policies, these populist policies continuing, or do you see him starting to roll some of them back in order to recover the Turkish economy?
That is a very challenging question. During the campaign, Erdogan made no indications that he would be changing his economic policies or that he would appoint advisors who would give him different directions in terms of attempting to recover Turkey's economic standing. Following the announcement that Erdogan had won the election, the lira sunk to a record low when trading against the dollar, and inflation continues to sit at 44%, indicating the severe economic difficulties that Turkey is facing, both due to ongoing external factors, but also due to Erdogan's economic policies that are entirely contrary to what other global forces are attempting to enact at the moment.
But I mean, he's won now. He doesn't have to cripple the economy any further, right? Surely he would just start rolling these back because, you know, he's got plenty of time to recover the economy. So, I mean, is he blinded to the implications? Are some of these ideological stances, or does he still feel bound to fulfill his campaign promises, even though he has a whole term, you know, in front of him?
I think that there is the potential for certain economic policies to be walked back, particularly considering the incoming and very likely balance of payments crisis that the central bank will face, given their rapid selling off of gold and foreign exchange currencies at the moment. However, given that Erdogan's alliance, the People's Alliance, won an outright majority in the Turkish parliament on that economic manifesto and economic policy promise, it's unlikely that we will see a wholesale repeal of his policies that have been enacted to date.
Essentially, he'll be undermining his entire base, his entire electoral base, if he was to roll back on that, I guess. Okay, so I mean, a difficult operating environment, and I'm just going to now move on to governance risk, as we classify it in Sibylline. You mentioned the earthquakes, obviously, that threw up, as it did the explosion in Lebanon some years ago, some shaky business practices in terms of construction and a certain level of cronyism, I guess you could classify it as that, or certainly governance risk was unmasked in the aftermath of the earthquakes. So given that, I mean, I'm assuming this didn't play too much of a part. Well, you said it played some part in the election, but clearly not enough. Is there any evidence that this, there's going to be a clampdown on these risky practices, that it will be an altogether more compliant operating environment? Are we going to continue to see these governance risks, cronyism, that kind of thing? Is that going to characterize his next term?
In all likelihood, unfortunately, it probably will. There was not a strong element during the election and campaigning process on cracking down on cronyism and clientelism, though there were obviously very emotive arguments made in the aftermath of the earthquake. Actual practical change has yet to be seen. Unfortunately, Erdogan's increasingly authoritarian tendencies has also been linked to tighter crackdowns on, say, opposition figures and political dissent, particularly those calling out corruption and asking for reform of governance issues within government. Therefore, I don't think that we are likely to see seismic change in this area thanks to Erdogan's re-election.
Okay, so, not great news for, investing in the country and doing business in Turkey. Not great news for the economy. I want to move on to the Kurdish question, if I may, because he cited the inclusion of a Kurdish partner in the opposition coalition as a potential factor in why it didn't get across the line. Now, I think Erdogan has been increasingly hawkish. You may wish to disagree on the Kurdish question over recent years. Will he see this as an endorsement of his position on the Kurdish question, and therefore do we see further hawkishness manifesting in increase of attacks and or that what we've seen over the last 12, 24 months?
Absolutely. It is highly likely that Erdogan will interpret his re-election as a validation of his policy towards Kurds, both within Turkey and within northern Iraq and Syria. It is highly likely that Turkey will continue to expand its military footprint in Iraq and in Syria and conduct further campaigns against the PKK in their various strongholds throughout the region. This obviously sustains quite a lot of risks, particularly in terms of retaliation, but also collateral damage to individuals and assets that are located in Turkey's sort of Kurdish regions, as well as those in Syria and Iraq.
So no change in tack, and I guess, just looking at other regional partners, you mentioned Iraq, Syria, you don't see his re-election impacting those relationships at all. They will carry on as they have been, given what you just said about the Kurdish question. Is that fair to say?
I believe so. In general, I think that we can characterize the re-election of Erdogan as a vote for continuity and a vote for decreased political volatility. Even so, these type of votes are not going to resolve long-standing and long-term socioeconomic health indicators that may, in fact, aggravate political volatility, but that's a much more long-term consideration than that which has just been voted for.
And we talk about consistency, Megan. Where Erdogan, I think, has been somewhat inconsistent is on the question of NATO. I think it's fair to say. Obviously, Turkey, huge place in NATO, second largest army, and I think it's fair to say has been somewhat of a troubled partner of late. Particularly, in terms of Finland and Sweden's accession to the bloc and to the alliance, rather. Erdogan's seen it as fairly transactional, I think, the relationship. That obviously took a little bit of a meander during the aftermath of the earthquake, with many NATO countries offering aid. Do you see that continuity with what I say? That continuity. What does the relationship with NATO look like now in this fifth term?
So Erdogan is likely to continue to use his position as Turkish president to act as a intermediary and balancer between NATO, the West, and Russia, particularly in the East. At that point, I think that we are likely to see continuity with policy, particularly when it comes to stalling the ascension of Finland and Norway into NATO, given Turkey's interest in maintaining its relationship with Russia. This is based on both bilateral trade, tourism, and a warm relationship between Erdogan and Putin, who have referred to one another as friends. At that point, the relationship with NATO is unlikely to significantly change in the short term, unless there were, say, some extreme escalation around Turkey, say in Ukraine, or if there was a significant shift in the global defense landscape when it came to pitting NATO against Russia.
That's really interesting you bring up Russia there, because I know we've not got our Eurasia desk with us today, but in your opinion, will Erdogan be swayed by, what may happen in the next 12 months in Ukraine? So, for example, if there is a collapse of Russian forces, if there's if the wind blows substantially towards, a Ukrainian partial or complete victory, do you think at that point, Erdogan being a pragmatic individual, he would look to back the right horse, or do you think his relationship with Putin is genuinely friendly, as you say, resolute?
Certainly, Erdogan is a pragmatic leader. He has never been one to back a losing horse for the sake of backing a losing horse. However, his relationship with Putin and Turkey's relationship with Russia is underscored by high levels of bilateral trade and Turkey buying significant amounts of natural gas from Gazprom, and Gazprom having extended Turkey multiple credit facilities in the past when there have been issues with balance of payments. Therefore, it's fair to say that the relationship between those two countries is not simply based on passing geopolitical trends or potential changes in leadership, but rather on bilateral trade. However, if there were to be a decrease in that or a significant negative externality for Turkey in its relationship with Russia, then it is possible that we would see a shift towards supporting Ukraine and the Zelensky government.
And do you think that could extend to Turkish arms, significant amounts of Turkish arms going to either side, going to Ukraine, Turkish air assets, whatever the case may be? Or do you think it will be more geopolitical, diplomatic support?
I think that we're probably looking at more geopolitical and diplomatic support. That is what Turkey has operationalized in the past in negotiating the Black Sea grain export deal. But also Turkish military supplies are currently very preoccupied with maintaining their stronghold in Syria and in Iraq in addressing the Kurdish problem. And so whereas other nations may have been able to contribute weapons based on the fact they were not being actively used at all times, that's not necessarily the case for Turkey. I think we would have to see far more significant changes in the military landscape for that to even be a possibility.
Understood. And a really interesting dynamic, I think. So we talked about, we talked about Syria, Iraq, NATO, Russia. Before I get into my last one or two questions, do you think there are any other international relationships, be they geopolitical, diplomatic or trade, that stand to benefit or lose out of his Erdogan's re-election?
So Erdogan has made it clear that he wishes to cultivate trade relationships throughout the Middle East and North Africa. He has grown trade quite substantially with Israel and different Gulf economies. Given efforts of multiple Gulf countries to diversify their trade and their economic balances, I think it's very fair to say that we would see those relationships continue to develop. In terms of decreasing relationships or sort of negatively impact relationships, I think one particular area of concern would be Syria, considering Erdogan's promise to increase efforts to repatriate multiple refugees of the 3.7 million, which are currently resident in Turkey. It's potential that we would see a negative impact on bilateral relations between Turkey and Syria. However, considering the state at which they are at the moment, I don't think we should necessarily see that as unexpected.
Thank you. That's really clear. And before I get into the very last question, what does this mean for Turks? We talked about, the economy, governance and corruption, and security concerns in the south, and with the Kurdish attacks. Just by way of, I guess, conclusion summary, executive summary, what does this mean for folks in Turkey, either Turks themselves or folks, operating businesses, organizations, NGOs within Turkey?
So, in essence, while this vote has been a vote for continuity, whether or not that continuity is going to benefit the population both socially and economically remains to be established. Economically, things are not looking great in Turkey. Inflation is very high, it is incredibly stubborn, and it's not currently being adequately addressed by cuts to interest rates. There is an oncoming crisis when it comes to the central bank's reserves of foreign currencies and gold, and continued efforts at spending and spending one's way out of the current economic difficulties that Turkey is facing are unlikely to yield profitable results. So at that point, we are looking at a relatively negative economic forecast for individuals living in Turkey at the moment. In reference to civil society, Erdogan is very unlikely to roll back his authoritarian tendencies. He's likely to continue cracking down on dissent and restricting civil liberties, which will make it more challenging to operate as non-governmental organizations, as opposition groups, or as those just calling out different political factors that potentially need addressing. So in all likelihood, the socio-political outlook for Turkey at the moment is relatively the same, but unfortunately has great capacity for becoming much worse in the short, medium and long term.
Well, Megan, I always like to end on a positive note. So despite this, will the Turkish people have another crack at the whip in a few years' time, or is Erdogan likely to seek to, I don't know, elongate his reign in office? What's your opinion on that? Are we going to see this again anytime soon?
Well, I think it is likely that we will see elections again in Turkey. Democratic participation is very high. It's a value that is very prized in Turkish society. And so we're unlikely to see an indefinite extension of Erdogan's rule. It is possible that he will run for re-election in 5 years' time. However, his age may be more of a consideration at that point, as he potentially considered retirement. And also another positive factor to focus on is that the opposition in this election has been very pragmatic. It has been very unified. And so while there is the potential for cracks along different party lines in the next governance period, at the same time, a pragmatic opposition may be able to foster more productive policy debate and passage.
And are there any, before the next election in 5 years' time, are there any other political indicators, triggers and warnings that our listeners, viewers, clients might be able to look for that might signal some kind of shift either way, or an increasing shift from the current regime?
Absolutely. So Erdogan is a fan of hosting referendums when he is considering changes to the political system. So any announcement of a referendum or changing to voting regulations should be carefully considered in terms of informing the electoral landscape. Any significant changes to economic policy may also be a signal that there is greater change to come, as that has been the bedrock of Erdogan's campaign thus far. And any shifting alliances within the parliament. Turkey is a country that has multiple party residents in the parliament, and therefore alliances often form and disperse at different times, at which point any change in that landscape should be considered very carefully.
Well, Megan, thank you so much for that. I know the Middle East and Africa desk is very busy at the minute looking at this and producing retrospective and preemptive analysis, as we have done throughout this entire period. And of course, we have many clients coming to us for bespoke analysis on this as well. Very important subject, and I'm very grateful for you joining us today. So thank you very much, and we look forward to welcoming you back to the pod.
Thank you, and thank you for having me.
Well, that's it for another edition of Sibylline Insights. Thank you very much for joining us, and of course, thank you very much to Megan. Please do remember to like and subscribe, however you've got this podcast, and we look forward to welcoming you to the next podcast, hopefully from Sibylline Studios next time. But for now, do take care and see you then.